Hello friends, welcome to ePathshala. I'm Ruchika Joshi, working as an assistant professor at Postgraduate Government College for Girls, Sector 42, Chandigarh. The name of our paper is International Relations Theory and the name of the module is Gramscian Concepts in the Analysis of International Relations. In this paper, we'll develop an understanding about hegemony and counter-hegemony as depicted by Antonio Gramsci in his book Prison Notebooks. We'll also understand the different dynamics in theoretical as well as in practical terms. We'll understand how the state and civil society is being used for hegemony in the country. The role of the state in defining interstate political discourse remains the cornerstone of the international relations study. The state-centric approach in the conventional international relations discourse has focused on interstate dynamics, and through various theoretical approaches, international relations theorists have attempted to understand the role of state actors in shaping international affairs. In this regard, the strand of Marxist theory that emerged from the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci has assumed paramount significance in the study of international relations, particularly in the international political economy. Several scholars such as Robert Cox, Stephen Gill, and Richard Little and so on have tried to employ Gramscian ideas to interpret the role of the state and the other important elements such as ideology, culture, role of civil society, ethnic forces, social blocs, etc. in international relations. So this chapter tries to provide an overview of the Gramsci's prominent ideas, hegemony and counter-hegemony, which have immense bearing on international relations. In the first part of the chapter, an attempt is made to understand the notion of hegemony, both in the theoretical and practical aspects of the term. The second part of the chapter analyzes the notion of counter-hegemony, and the concluding part elucidates the significance of both these notions in international relations in the contemporary period. Antonio Gramsci is considered to be one of the influential thinkers of 20th century. Antonio Gramsci, born in Sardinia in Italy, was one of the founding members of the Italian Communist Party, who was imprisoned during the period of fascist rule in interwar period in the first half of the 20th century. While in prison, Gramsci prepared his reflections as notes on various themes such as philosophy, political theory, culture, literary criticisms, economics, which were compiled later as prison notebooks. He conceived ideas like hegemony and counter-hegemony in order to analyze the prevalent power structures and counter-forces operating against it. Though Gramsci has attempted to analyze the state-civil society ties, mainly centering on the domestic setting of Italian state under fascism, there are attempts later by scholars to stretch it into the international realm. Scholars such as Robert Cox, Stephen Gill, and so on applied Gramscian ideas into international realm to interpret how power operates between and among states and groups. This has raised certain fundamental questions regarding its applicability, as there is no world state and arguably no transnational civil society. However, certain scholars attempt to interpret trends in changing global realities through Gramscian ideas such as hegemony and counter-hegemony. The notion of hegemony. In general, the term hegemony is used widely in international relations theory to represent the most powerful state in an international system. Gramsci used the concept of hegemony in order to show how a state exerts power over the living population of a given territory. At a broader level, the notion of hegemony, according to Gramsci, can be used to analyze relations of forces in a given society. Briefly, a hegemonic order is the one where consent rather than coercion primarily characterizes the relations between classes and between the state and society. In a hegemonic setup, the power of the ruling class or class fractions which dominate over the others is partly exercised through the state. It is not simply a case of dominance through sanctions, punishments, or inducement. It also involves intellectual and moral leadership. Therefore, the hegemony that dominant group builds is ideological. In the process of executing the building of ideologically oriented hegemony, the dominant group generates common sense, the uncritical and partly unconscious way in which people perceive the world. In fact, such a build-up of common sense and consequent processes of state power is given a legitimate status and is manifested through forces operating in civil society. Gramsci defines civil society as the set of all institutions that do not belong either to the state or to the realm of economic production. The media, churches, schools, and trade unions are an integral part of civil society where hegemony is built and reinforced. In Gramsci's perception, hegemony is applied within a wider social and political constellation of forces or historic bloc. In general, a historic bloc implies a historical congruence between material forces, institutions, and ideologies, or broadly, an alliance of different forces. Thus, a historic bloc refers to an organic link between political and civil society, a fusion of material, institutional, intersubjective, theoretical, and ideological capacity, order. In practice, at international level, in the latter half of 20th century, this historic bloc of social forces that centered on the United States served as the socio-political centerpiece of post-war organic alliance in the West, which contributed immensely to produce hegemony in favor of the capitalist state. This bloc originated in the outward expansion of emerging social forces within the United States, comprising the capitalist class, multinational corporations, and financial capitalists. The chief elements in this constellation sought to internationalize New Deal principles and associated forms of Fordist capital-intensive process of production, mass consumption, accumulation, and extension of opportunities for export and or foreign direct investment, both in manufacturing and extractive industries, notably in oil. In fact, this process can be deciphered from the global expansion of financial capital, MNCs, management strategies, and business practices. These trappings of global capitalism assumed a near total acceptance among the states. There were several instances of hegemony in the past. For instance, 19th century Pax Britannica and 20th century Pax Americana are instances wherein capitalistic or imperialistic states could establish a hegemonic liberal international economic order which was built employing states and civil society elements. In fact, according to Anthony Giddens, to many living outside Europe and North America, it looked uncomfortably like westernization or perhaps Americanization, since the US is now the sole superpower with a dominant economic, cultural, and military position in the current global scenario. Many of the most visible cultural expressions of the globalization are American Coca-Cola, McDonald's, and cable news network CNN. In fact, this aspect can be understood from the massive penetration of internet and global media around the world, including the entertainment industry. The internet is operated by firms largely based from the United States. Big corporations such as CNN, British Broadcasting Corporation BBC, News Corp, and so on manage the global media, especially the visual media. Similarly, big business houses of Europe and the United States own and manage most of the widely circulated print media. In addition, the cultural industry of the capitalist grouping, which includes movies, music, and literature, has had an all-pervasive dominance on all the societies across the world. The new social networking websites such as Facebook and Twitter are owned and operated by firms from the United States. According to Roland Robertson, a prominent sociologist, the expansion of the media of communication, not least the development of global television and of other new technologies of rapid communication and travel, has made people all over the world more conscious of other places and of the world as a whole. Indeed, it has led to universalized cultural notions and a homogenized structure. This form of culture has widely intruded into most societies of the world because the capitalist bloc controls the majority of these instruments of cultural communication. The acceptance of this culture among people across the world on a large scale gives legitimacy to the ideology of capitalism, at least implicitly, if not explicitly. In sum, the revolutionized information and communication system of today is one of the more ways of the hegemonization of the West. The world in the last several centuries shows that different capabilities and power resources such as military, industry, trade, etc. played critical role in building power at different points of time. In the present times, for instance, technologies such as software communication and biotechnology have assumed greater significance than core technologies. For instance, the trade in information technology constitutes a large share in world merchandise. The software and other knowledge-based industries are spread all over the world, with even developing states such as India, Israel, Ireland, and Malaysia having made a mark in the software industry, knowledge-based industries, and after the internet revolution, the number of internet connections have increased rapidly. In sum, one can draw a few general inferences from the nature of the power in the international arena in the contemporary period. Power is becoming less transferable, less tangible, less coercive, and more consent-based in this age of capitalism under globalization, information-based economies, and transnational interdependence. Accordingly, the role of technology, capital, and knowledge have become prominent tools of consent formation, which in turn relates to power equations in contemporary society. In fact, technology is one of the major pillars of any form of production that no state can afford to lose. Logical capability determines the position of each state in the current global scenario. Because of large-scale research and development undertaken in the developed state, it is but natural that they become the possessor of advanced technology. These newly created technologies are guarded to keep comparative advantage over other states. There are many agencies involved in the formation of hegemony. With regard to hegemony, formation in international relations, Robert Cox explains as to how the international organizations of diverse kind serve as mechanisms through which the universal norms of world hegemony are expressed. In this context, Cox has identified the following important functions which international organizations perform. They embody the rules which facilitate the expansion of world orders. They ideologically legitimate the norms of the world order, and they co-opt the elite from the peripheral state. This is manifested through a process called of transformismo, and in the process co-opt counter-hegemonic ideas into the hegemonic world. The notion of counter-hegemony. In Gramsci's conception of a social group manifests its hegemony through both domination as well as intellectual and moral leadership. A social group must already exercise leadership or secure consent from the rest of the society before attaining political power, and can maintain continued power through a continuation of leadership. When confronted with that, Gramsci termed an organic crisis, that is, where the ruling class loses its consensus and is only dominant through coercive force. Hegemony is weak and has to be replaced by a new order. In this context, hegemonic projects are begun, reinvented, and reinforced in order to maintain a firm consensus, a transformation which in Gramsci's terms is known as passive revolution. He pointed out that dominant ideas and the social forces behind the ideas had to be confronted first before a revolution could occur. It means an ideological and intellectual confrontation with hegemonic groups in the realm of civil society, of what Gramsci calls war of position, is a necessity before the working class or marginal undertake the revolution. War of position broadly implies creation of counter ideas arguments on part of working subaltern class against the dominant ideology, arguments of the hegemonic group in the civil society. According to Gramsci, the process is initiated by organic intellectuals. In other words, for a revolution to be effective, it must not only physically overthrow the dominant classes, but it must confront the hegemonic ideas of the dominant classes which create a common sense. For example, the notion that the market can regulate itself. Gramsci underscored the need for an effective counter-hegemony to permeate the social, cultural and ideological foundations of society in order to sustain power and consensus. Successful counter-hegemony is one that replaces the existing historic bloc. A counter-hegemonic force emerges in the scene against any historic bloc that stands for the formation of hegemony in capitalistic society. In fact, every historic bloc leaves room for the development of a counter-hegemonic project that stakes its claim for the hegemony in any social formation. Thus, in the context of capitalistic hegemony, the discordant elements within the subaltern or subordinate classes rise to organize their counter-hegemonic project. In substance, the major method of counter-hegemony is to expose the theoretical base of imperialism or world capitalism and to build resistance and strategies to nullify the effect of hegemonic tendencies. At the global level, there have been several such resistance against capitalism. For instance, in recent times, there have been instances of resistance against capitalism under globalization, especially against institutions and agencies that promote capitalism in the contemporary times, notably WTO. The massive protest staged by the people, regardless of class, race, gender and region, against globalization at the venue of the third ministerial conference of WTO on 30th November 1999 at Seattle can be broadly discerned as an instance of counter-hegemonic project. The battle in Seattle can be linked on to new patterns of political agency and a movement that goes well beyond the politics of identity and of course differences. The Occupy Wall Street movement in the United States in 2011 and subsequent Occupy movements in 85 countries can be broadly compared to counter-hegemonic projects against capitalism and globalization. In sum, these movements are beginning to form what Gramsci called an organism, a complex element of civil society which resists the historic bloc in a capitalistic hegemony. So by this time we understood that Gramsci's concept of hegemony has been widely used in the arena of international politics. We also understood that how the states use hegemony over their population and how that hegemony is countered by the social forces working in that state. We had learned the practical as well as the theoretical aspects of hegemony by different examples cited by different authors, and this hegemony is done by two ways, by coercion as well as by consent. Hope you learned this right now in a good manner.